Perfect. So yes, my name is Claire. I'm a history and archaeology graduate and the Neolithic is my bag. So we're going to be delving into that this evening. As you may guess from the nature of the topic, this presentation does include some images of human and animal remains. So just be aware of that before we start. Not too many, but just something to be aware of. So the British Neolithic dates from around 4000 to 2500 BCE, but the early British Neolithic is dated to 4000 to roughly 3500. So the earliest chunk, and not very long in the grand scheme of things. My research focused on monuments within mainland UK, so not Ireland, not Orkney or any other outlying islands. And the monuments that are prevalent in this period are long barrows. So there's an example of West Kennet long barrow just at the bottom. Round barrows, which are similarly constructed, but round rather than long. And then causewayed enclosures. There's an artist impression of one here because they are earthwork structures. So they are harder to see in the landscape, but I heard them recently explained as like a chain of sausages, which I quite like. So they're ditches with causeways in between them. So if you think of the ditch as the sausage and the causeway as the link, they sort of are that shape, and they'd be roughly circular in varying numbers of rings. So they'll be the monuments that we'd be looking at from this period. So ritual and violence. It was originally thought that the Neolithic was quite a peaceful time, this sort of idyllic landscape and people settling down and domestication and agriculture. But it turns out that archaeologists have found human remains with injuries consistent with all types of conflict, including warfare. So not quite as peaceful as we thought. And the early Neolithic was when it was at its most brutal. A good example of that in microcosm is the arrowhead technology of the period. So the Mesolithic that was just being discussed before, that preceded directly the Neolithic, they had multi-barbed arrows designed to lodge in the flesh of prey. So it would leave a blood trail, perfect for hunter-gatherers trying to find their prey that they had just wounded. As we enter the early British Neolithic, we see leaf-shaped arrowheads. There's images of them on the screen at the moment. As you can see, they are sharp and deadly, and they would pierce flesh very easily and were much more readily used against humans, not just animals. As we leave the early Neolithic and move towards the middle and later periods, the arrowheads evolved into a form that was much less aerodynamic than these leaf-shaped ones. So they caused wounds that would have been spectacular to see, but much less lethal. So this early Neolithic period was definitely the most brutal and the most violent, overarching. Monuments in this era at the early part of the Neolithic were centres of ritual activity, but they also saw lots of use as burial sites, especially long and round barrows. So lots of ritual burial, but also just an uptick in general violence within society in the period. I carried out research that built upon that carried out by Martin Smith in 2013-14, but I also looked at excavation reports, other articles, other studies into inhumation in the period to get an overarching picture of how many violently killed individuals had been specifically selected for burial at monuments. And unlike other studies in this area, I only looked at catastrophic level trauma. So evidence of unhealed injuries that were likely to be the direct cause of death or associated with a violent event that led to death, like projectile injuries. I found 20 sites, so not a huge number, but not an insignificant number of sites that contain the remains of 29 individuals, of which 25 had been conclusively violently killed, and 4 were highly probable. So that meant that they were found either with an arrowhead not embedded within the skeletal remains, but in such association that it seemed highly suggestive of a fatal injury, most likely from soft tissue damage. Understandably, they were quite rare to find. In terms of what I found out about the individuals, in terms of sex, 41% were male and 18% were female. But the remaining 41% were undetermined. We couldn't tell the sex. So while we might automatically assume to find a higher rate of males experiencing violent deaths, because of the same percentage of being indeterminate, we actually can't tell what the gender split was. But there were definitely females in the record, that's undisputable. Cause of death also sees an interesting split. Of those that were unknown, it's fairly evenly split between projectile and blunt force trauma. For males, it is evenly split, 6 projectile deaths and 6 blunt force trauma. But for females, where we have the confirmed sex as female, no projectile deaths at all, only blunt force trauma deaths. We have on the right-hand side a skull that has experienced blunt force trauma. You can see there's the 3 areas of the wounds and then the fracture of the skull, and that's from an adult female skull. And then below we have an example of an embedded arrow within a vertebra. So this data about the cause of death and the sex actually aligns with data collated from this area across all of Europe, which finds that males are generally affected by projectiles, but cranial injuries or blunt force trauma injuries seem to vary between male and female. So this isn't just isolated to England, it seems to be a wider pattern as well. Interestingly, when we look at age, considering it's quite a small number of individuals, it's only 29 of them, we do have a spread all the way from adult, young adult, adolescent, and unfortunately even a young child found at Bellisnap who had died from blunt force trauma. So we're really covering a broad demographic here. Now, what does that tell us about violence in the Neolithic and also about how ritual was used in this period? Well, I think while it's clearly not super common, it's definitely frequent enough in the record to suggest that there was an intention to the selection of these individuals for deposition at these monuments. And the demographic range, male, female, all age groups, could suggest that this is a reflection of the impact of the increased violence of the period and how it was affecting all aspects of the population, all different members of the community. It also strongly implies that there was an uptick in the types of violence. So we've got both domestic and sort of what we're more likely to see from intercommunity. So blunt force trauma is generally close quarters violence, whereas when you're using projectiles, it can be sort of long distance weaponry between different communities. So a broad spectrum of violence was happening to a broad spectrum of people. It must have been quite an unsettling time. And the fact that this was having an impact on how people viewed the world and processed the world is also seen in the way that animal remains were being treated in this period as well. So animals and humans were developing a different relationship in this period as the domestication, agriculture, settlements were happening. Animals and humans had always had a relationship, but this was becoming sort of reformed as their roles were changing, and they were part of identity construction, and they were a significant part of ritual. We see that in Scarborough and Cambridgeshire, there were 2 animals who were violently killed. One was a cow that was poleaxed, and one was an auroch, in which you can see in the picture the stone axe is still embedded in its forehead that was used to kill it. So it's a hyper-violent form of killing these animals, and it would have been quite a spectacle of violence. And then they were selected for deposition. We see a comparative treatment of animal remains and human remains in this period as well that relates to violent behaviour. So at Beckhampton Long Barrow, 3 cattle skulls were placed along the axial divide of the Long Barrow, so in structurally significant places, which might be associated with the strength of cows and supporting the structure. However, the central skull had experienced severe blunt force trauma that it had survived. It had started to heal. It's likely it had actually been looked after, having experienced that trauma. And then once it did die, it was selected to be in the central area of the Long Barrow. We see this paralleled with a young male skull that was found at Staines Causeway enclosure. He had extensive blunt force trauma damage that he had survived. His death was actually caused by a slashing cut through the neck and jaw, but the blunt force trauma wounds had healed. So in both instances, this cow and this person, they had experienced extensive violence. They had survived it, and then they were chosen to be deposited at these monuments. So the violent aspect is significant. It may be they symbolised hope of surviving the trauma, or it was the strength that they exhibited in surviving it. In a slightly less brutal example, at Windmill Hill Causewayed Enclosure, we find the skull of a child nestled within the frontal skull part of an ox. And also a child's femur was found placed within the marrow cavity of an ox's humerus, which speaks of the ox being strong and big, protecting this child in its journey and death. And we see a parallel in an adult that had been killed by a projectile being buried alongside an infant, a young child, and a young adult female. So again, a person who may have died protecting their community, or just a very brave, strong person, is buried alongside people you may expect to want to protect on their journey. So there does appear to be a desire to process this changing social landscape of increased violence by expressing more ritualized violence or selecting violently killed individuals for a ritual process at monuments. So what does that tell us about violence, ritual, and monuments in this period? Well, we can only speculate about the motives of these communities, but I think it's quite clear to see that as violence increased, people were trying to find ways to process and understand that change. The ritualized behavior was carried out on a broad demographic of individuals. It was also reflected on the treatment of animal remains, which seems to suggest that violence had sort of permeated the whole social landscape, and it was needing to be processed on multiple different levels. I think it's quite interesting that as violence of the era abated and we enter the later Neolithic, the use of earlier British Neolithic monuments sort of died out, and we see the emergence in the landscape of different monuments like henges, which we believe were more social places rather than burial sites. So you can imagine a monument like a henge, like Stonehenge. It would have taken big groups to build and inter-community collaboration. And it might be that this collaboration that was required in constructing these later monuments could have been a response and a way to address the violence of the past. It could also have been a way, it's that which is also reflected in the usage of these spaces, that they were created for the living, they weren't created for the dead. But that's a big other topic that's very interesting, but potentially for a different presentation. What I just think is really interesting about these communities and what they were going through is that as things were happening outside of their control and things were becoming more challenging and violence was upticking in their communities, they were trying to find a way to get some control and a semblance of understanding of the world around them, which I think is just something very human and something that we can probably all relate with today. So yeah, that is what I have to tell you about violence and ritual in that period. These references relate to this presentation, but I do have additional reading and additional data from my own research. So if you're interested in this topic, you're more than welcome to contact me at any point.